This is The Initiate. Came out 3 months ago, and it feels like 3 decades. Much has transpired since then. But yes, this was published February 4th. It's from Baen, and it is my first fantasy novel. It's a modern day fantasy. My elevator pitch description is, what if John Wick was Harry Potter? It's someone discovers that he becomes part of a secret order of wizards and starts murdering them all. So what I'm going to read you is a chapter from the middle of the book, in which our hero and his mentor travel into the other world in search of answers from a supernatural being. The protagonist is named Sam Arcaro, although he often goes by the name Ace as an alias. This is the summer of 2015, I think. As the city sweltered through August, Sam found himself busier than he had ever been in his life. He was getting instruction from Sylvia, Moreno, and Lucas, and of course he had to keep his contact with Lucas secret from the others. During those weeks, he recruited more spirits to his service. On Lammas Eve, he climbed to the roof of Columbia's Butler Library, where he bound a sylph into a tin pinky ring, and then secured a year's spirit from a song spirit, making his words more persuasive. As the equinox ticked closer, Sam made preparations. At the beginning of September, he took the late morning train to Bridgeport and picked up a rental car, then drove 10 miles north along the Housatonic River to White Hills, where he had once lived. He took his time and stuck to back roads, and stopped for lunch at a fast food place where nobody would recognize him. No point in stopping by the house, he thought. Any traces of the attack would be long gone. No point to it at all, he thought. But he allowed sheer muscle memory to direct the car and wound up at the foot of the long driveway up the wooded hillside. The new owners had put in a new mailbox. Not the kind he would have chosen. The little patch of flowers around the base was nice, though. Did they have kids, these new people? Was some new child marking up the walls as Tommy had done? Had they painted over the growth marks on the kitchen door frame? No, he decided. No point in trying to find out. It wasn't his house anymore. He gunned the car motor unnecessarily and drove off. The storage unit was a few miles away, and he could get through the gate with a number code. No need to see anyone at all, which was good. In his current mood, he didn't want to talk to anyone. All the things it had smashed were long gone, but he had kept the hall rug his mother had bought in Bogota. It had walked on that rug. There might be traces. Sam had watched Moreno call up the div which had slain Feng by using a chunk of wood it had marked. A rug the Anzu had marked with its claws would be almost as good. He found the hall rug, and then looked at the boxes labeled A for Alice and T for Tommy. Sam knew their full names. He had things which were theirs, probably even traces of them. Hair, blood, whatever. They were linked to him closer than anyone else. He could summon their spirits. Her family's burial plot near New London wasn't far. He could do it tonight. The moment it occurred to him, he felt two overwhelming emotions. He wanted more than anything to do it, to speak to them both again, and yet the very idea horrified him. For a moment, he struggled to keep from throwing up. It felt like a desecration. They would despise him for it. No. Let them rest. Focus on punishing the guilty. He unrolled the rug and examined it. Should have gotten it cleaned, he thought, looking at the mud and sawdust ground into the pattern. Luckily he hadn't, though. That meant a better chance of finding some trace of the Anzu. Had it made those little tears? Possibly, yes. There were places where the fabric was torn in parallel groups of 3. Unless the cops and paramedics had been wearing golf shoes, that wasn't the work of human feet. He had a connection to the killer. Sam rolled the rug up again and tossed it in the back seat of his rental car. On the way back to Bridgeport, he passed the house again and couldn't avoid slowing down once more. Not for the first time, he thought about just chucking it all. Burn his William Hunter documents and credit cards, smash the phones, delete the email accounts, and stay plain old Samuel Arcaro for the rest of his life. No more lying. Except he wouldn't be plain old Samuel Arcaro. He'd still be a wizard and a murderer. There was no path back to his old life. Time to admit that. He was William Hunter now, and he had a job to do. The night before the autumn equinox, Sam and Lucas met at Trinity Church, sitting through the end of a folk music coffee house, which proved to be more of a political rally with guitar interruptions. Sam fidgeted while Lucas nodded patiently along with the music and chuckled softly at the slogans. When the event finally ended, the two of them went back out to the street and walked up Broadway. "Why do we always meet in churches?" Sam asked. "It's a good place to shake spiritual surveillance," said Lucas. "Would a synagogue or a mosque do just as well?" "There are theological subtleties at work. It must be hallowed ground. This church is Episcopalian, which means it was consecrated by a priest in the line of apostolic succession. Catholic and Orthodox churches qualify as well. Quaker meeting houses and Christian Science reading rooms don't. A synagogue is more complicated. It's not the building per se, but the ark holding the Torah that is sacred. So for our purposes, they're only useful when services are going on and the ark is open. Mosques are usually safe, although there are a great many ways they can be profaned. But how can all that be true? Those religions all say the others are false. Who's right?" Lucas chuckled. "All of them and none, but to us they only matter as tools to manipulate the world, both magically and politically. We Apkallu are free of all that. But enough of that. Here we are." Sam looked up. They were standing on the corner of Warren Street and Broadway, across the street from City Hall. Lucas led the way into the building on the corner. A security guard was on duty inside and looked up alert. "I'm here to see Mr. Beach," said Lucas. The guard's eyes unfocused for a moment, and he nodded at them and looked away as if losing interest completely. "The password is just a convenience. I use this place fairly often and have all the security people conditioned." The two of them went downstairs into the basement, past the pipes and valves of the water system, and eventually reached the eastern wall. Lucas worked his way along the old brickwork of the foundation until he found an ancient-looking cast iron door just 4 feet high. The old iron latch was locked with a shiny new combination lock. Lucas unlocked it and gestured to Sam. "If you would do the honors, it's often a bit stiff." Sam had to hit the latch lever with the heel of his hand to move it, and then swung the door open. The hinges squealed loudly, but Lucas didn't seem to worry about the noise. Beyond was blackness. Lucas clicked on a pocket flashlight and went through the little door, stepping cautiously. "Mind the step," he said. Sam followed him down a set of 3 wobbly wooden steps onto a floor of mosaics? Yes, marble mosaics. He looked up as Lucas played the flashlight over the arched ceiling. Gilt patterns twinkled back at him. "What is this?" "This is the first and only station on the Beach Pneumatic Subway line. Constructed 1869, but the inventor didn't bribe the right people and so never got to complete the project." He pointed off to the east, where a concrete wall cut off the end of the room. "The BMT is on the other side of that retaining wall. Now, tell me why I brought you here." Sam looked around and then laughed. "We're going on a journey." "Precisely. Doing this in an active subway station would be awkward, but this one is perfect. We can send our perceptions into the other world without having to worry about the bodies we leave behind. It's especially useful for us today, given that the sun is in the wrong decade and the moon is in an awkward phase. The fact that tomorrow is Wednesday is auspicious, though." Lucas spread out a picnic blanket and sat cross-legged. Sam poured out cornmeal to make a pentangle around the blanket, then stepped carefully over the lines and took his own place facing Lucas. The two of them chanted an invocation to Nabu and thrice great Hermes. And then Sam was startled by a wind and the noise of squealing brakes as a cylindrical subway car pulled into the station. He and Lucas stood, picked their way over the cornmeal, and got into the car. It was very luxurious inside, with leather seats and polished brass fittings. Sam risked a glance out the window as the car pulled away and saw himself and Lucas still sitting on the picnic blanket. It was one thing to know intellectually that this was a spiritual journey. It was quite another to actually see that he was no longer inhabiting his body. "Have you got something that it touched?" Lucas asked him. Sam fished out the 4-inch square of carpet bearing slashes from the monster's claws. Lucas had him hold it in a certain way, then invoked Umibael, Larunda, and Ariadne. Sam felt the carpet swatch tugging gently in his grip as if drawn by a magnet. They rode for a time Sam found hard to measure. It passed quickly enough, but somehow he knew, as one knows things in dreams, that it was a long journey. Outside the windows, the subway car passed through darkness, but occasionally he got glimpses of vast caverns and distant flows of glowing magma. Suddenly, the tugging sensation grew much stronger and pulled off to the right rather than straight ahead. "It's here," Sam called out, and felt the subway begin to slow. When the car squealed to a stop and the doors opened, the carpet swatch in Sam's hand almost pulled him out onto the platform beyond. Lucas hurried to keep up with him. The sky overhead was charcoal gray, and a few distant red lights glowed feebly, so Sam could barely make out his surroundings. The ground underfoot was soggy with lank weeds growing knee-high. The air reeked of sulfur and decay. Here and there he could make out vast, ugly structures rising from the swamp, along with skeletal towers of rusty metal and piles of slag and garbage. It looked familiar. "We're in New Jersey?" he asked Lucas. "The other world is highly subjective. Your mind needed a template for the dreary land of the dead, and this is what popped out. When I come to the other world by myself, it tends to look more like Anun." The two of them splashed across the swamp, and once again Sam couldn't tell if it was a long journey or a short one. They climbed up embankments and pushed through torn chain-link fences and eventually walked along cracked and potholed streets lined with decaying buildings. They began encountering people. The passers-by were thin, pale, almost translucent looking. Most of them were preoccupied with what looked to be overwhelming private grief, ignoring Sam and Lucas completely. It was a good thing Sam had to hang on to the tugging carpet square because it prevented him from utterly freaking out as he realized that these unhappy, wispy people were spirits of the dead. When he looked at them, they seemed unreal, like badly done animations. Some had more detail and individuality than others. Some of the most distinctive ones even met his own glance briefly. The rest ignored their surroundings entirely. As they penetrated deeper into the nightmare version of Secaucus, New Jersey, Sam saw a different sort of figure on the sidewalk ahead. It was big and solid looking, nearly as tall as Sam, even though it was sitting on the curb facing the street. When it saw the two of them, it stood, a 10-foot-tall man, broad and strong, with a frowning bull's head and gleaming black horns. "Let me handle this," said Lucas, hurrying to get in front of Sam. He bowed low to the bull man and spread his arms wide. Sam did likewise. "Go back," the bull man said. "We must go ahead," said Lucas. "Our errand here is brief, and then we will leave." "You are not dead, nor are you guardians of the dead. Go back." "We are initiates. We have passed 7 gates and returned. Let us pass." "Go back," the bull man said. Third time, Sam thought. Now it's going to happen. It did. The bull man lowered its head and charged at Lucas, but as it did, a tall, 4-winged figure appeared in the way, dazzlingly bright and armed with a mace wreathed in fire. The bull man gave an angry bellow and crashed into the Shedu, trying to knock it aside. The Shedu ignored the impact and swung its fiery mace almost as an afterthought. The blow knocked the bull man across the street. "Come on," said Lucas. Sam hurried after him. As the Shedu swatted the bull man again, it called to Lucas. "My service to you is done for all time, mortal man." "You owe me a replacement," said Lucas to Sam. "Binding that Shedu took me weeks of work." Another indeterminate walk down the sidewalk brought them to a large open square. where more than a dozen bird-headed Anzu lounged in ones and twos scattered around the edges. Some of them looked up when the two human wizards entered. The carpet swatch tugged Sam to the right, and he and Lucas walked toward a pair of Anzu sitting together as they passed a copper bowl of beer back and forth. The two creatures looked up as the men approached, but did not stand. All the other Anzu around the square were starting to drift toward the humans. Sam's mind was a mix of rage and terror. He knew exactly which of the two Anzu before him had been the one that came to his house, and he hated it. But the memory of how it had thrown him aside was strong, and the idea of being surrounded by a dozen of the creatures was like discovering a whole school of sharks circling him in the ocean. Lucas showed no sign of anxiety. He raised his voice and spoke a few words, and the approaching Anzu stopped. Then he addressed himself to the one which was still drawing the carpet swatch in Sam's outstretched hand like a magnet. You, woman slayer, we seek the answer to a question. The seated Anzu poured the last of its beer from the bowl into its upturned beak before replying. I have no answers for you, mortal man. Its voice was harsh and high-pitched, almost like a baby's cry. Lucas took the carpet sample from Sam and said something in Sumerian which made the Anzu flinch in pain. Speak the words I require. The creature lunged and snapped at Lucas like a tethered dog, unable to get within a yard of him. Do as I ask, and you shall have this token, said Lucas, brandishing the carpet. Resist, and I shall cast it into everlasting fire. Ask, and I will answer as you command, it said. Who sent you? Sam asked, but Lucas put a hand on his chest to restrain him. Leave this to me, I know the proper forms, he said. You, woman slayer, you went to the house of this man and shed the blood of his kin. We wish to know the reason. Speak as I have commanded. A man bid me do it, one of the wise. He gave me a flake of paint and told me to seek the house it came from. Slay all within, but spare the oldest in years was my charge. My companion wishes to know who gave the command. I am bound not to tell. I cannot. Lucas turned to Sam. This is an unexpected complication. I don't think I can undo someone else's binding, not without more time and preparation. He turned back to the Anzu. Describe the one who bound you. He used no name and wore a mask of feathers, the Anzu croaked. He carried the blood of the bargain as you do, but that is all I can say. Why? Did he tell you why? Sam asked. He did not say why, only bid me obey and then be gone. Where was it done? Where did he stand when he commanded you? A place of dead men near the house. Sam thought he knew which cemetery it meant. It didn't matter. The mystery magician had done a good job of covering his tracks. I charge you to guard us from all harm until we have passed out of this place, said Lucas. When we pass the final gate, you shall have this token, not before. Can't you get its name? Asked Sam. Not a fair trade, said Lucas. That would give us even more power over it than the carpet. Be satisfied with safe passage. But we haven't learned anything. Now is not the time. This wild goose chase has already cost me the service of a particularly difficult schedule. I have no desire to have to fight our way out. Sam began to protest, but stopped. He had picked out only one of the most distinct claw marks in the rug. There were others. He could try this again, better prepared now that he knew what to expect. The other Anzu in the plaza parted to let them by, but they didn't leave much room for the humans to pass, and leaned in menacingly. Their guide led Sam and Lucas down a different street from the one by which they had entered, which made Sam suspicious. What if it's leading us into a trap? He murmured to Lucas. Then I shall have to use another bound servant, and you will owe me even more. As they made their way through the dim streets, the Anzu spoke up in its unhappy baby voice. That was a good night, it said. I got to leave this place and taste fresh blood. Send me forth again, and I will slay all you wish. Silence, said Lucas, who actually sounded worried for the first time since they had boarded the subway car. Privately, Sam resolved to find out how to destroy a being like the Anzu. Whoever had sent it against his family would pay, oh yes. But he would not let the demon itself escape punishment either. Lucas had spoke of casting the carpet piece into everlasting fire. Maybe he could learn to do that. Let this monster burn in agony forever? It would be a start, anyway. And that's the end of that chapter.
How do you spell Anzu?
Anzu. It's Sumerian, so of course, the
Okay.
cuneiform is different, and probably doesn't have any vowels in it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's probably called a nz, in the technical literature.
Good. How did they end up on the roof of Butler Library?
Well, he had to climb up there, but
Well, how did he get? What was he doing at Columbia in the first place?
well, he's calling up a aerial spirit, so he needs to be on top of a place associated with symbolic associations and knowledge and spirit and air.
Is all this witchcraft stuff drawn from something? I don't know, the Sumerian beliefs or some other thing that.
Well, we don't know much about Sumerian practice, though there is a whole sequence when he's being initiated, which I cribbed from the Inanna's descent into the underworld. A lot of it is also just sort of Fraserian, and I cribbed a lot from Cornelius Agrippa. Because he has the whole symbolic associations of planets and what part of the sky the sun is in. And some of that comes from the Egyptians also. They were the ones who came up with the idea of dividing the sky into decans, which is these little 10-degree segments, which if we lived in a properly created universe would each be one day of the year, but they're not. But the Egyptians said, screw it, we don't care. And because the climate's the same here all year anyway. So, they didn't pay too much attention to the calendar. But so there were these like spirits associated with each 10-degree segment of the zodiac. And each of them had power over a different thing. And then, you have three of them makes up a zodiacal house, like Taurus or Sagittarius or whatever. So you have these gods of the movement of the sun, and occultists spend a lot of time, obviously, enjoying the hell out of themselves, making up names and portfolios for all of them.
Major backstory. This is a big change for you, Jim. You've written science fiction before. What made you decide you were going to do Harry Potter in New York? Harry Potter.
It was a misspent education. I got my undergraduate degree at Chicago in the history of science, and my particular focus was on the scientific revolution era, the 17th century sort of transition from what we would consider medieval science to modern science. And that meant that you had to be familiar with the very mystical underpinnings of a lot of modern science, especially since the people at the time did not distinguish between the two. Newton did alchemy. Robert Boyle got the laws against making gold repealed so that he could try it, I have a whole notebook full of that stuff. So I felt I ought to get some use out of it, justify spending all that money on college tuition. And plus, stuff that interests me. So I have a whole section of my bookcase here, here I can even turn I have a whole section of the bookcase here I call the weird stuff section. And so, it's all, things like, you can get the Clavis Solomonis now from Dover Books. In fact, that's a minor plot point in the novel, is that they have access to the versions of these occult works which haven't been redacted, the unexpurgated versions, which have the stuff that works in them.
Now that's your characters or the library?
The characters, and in fact, so one of the other characters, the one named Moreno, part of his job is to make sure that there's no unexpurgated copies of books circulating, because despite the fact that magic is confined to a lineage, they all know that there's probably a lot more people out there with the ability to do it than they can keep track of.
So is the initial Bella for the beginning of the series?
It could be. I mean, I left room for a sequel, and I even know what it would be about. At some point, probably in the next couple of months, I will be sending, a query to Tony Weisskopf at Bain saying, what do you want me to write next? A sequel to Initiate, or another, a follow-up to Godel Operation, or a sequel to Arcade's World, or something new, and we'll see what she says.
How is the transition to Bain?
Oh, fine. It does mean that I have to be a little more proactive and self-starting about book promotion.
Mhm.
The book tour consists of, they'll reimburse me for gas when I drive to bookstores. There's no being shipped off to the West Coast to visit Powell's in Portland anymore.
Mhm.
Mm.
Well, there probably isn't for Tor either. They had some layoffs recently.
Yes, I imagine that's true.
People doing
Who knows?
online book
Who
tours.
knows what happens in the new order of things?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Are people doing online book tours with all the lockdowns?
That's a damn good question. I don't know.
I know I think
I
Powell
did.
would have a meet the author kind of event online these days, I would hope. I haven't looked to see, but
It would be an obvious thing to do.
Bookstores are just starting to do it.
well, this would be a good, one of the problems with book tours and stuff is they always happen at a time I can't go. So unless it's you coming to town and making a point of going, I rarely make it to any, even ones I would be very interested in. But if they were online, even in remote places.
I think the interesting thing about their being online is that they're also recorded, so that you
Good point.
don't have to go to a book event in real time, as it were.
I was at an online event with Monica Byrne this morning, which was run by a place called Space 10 in Copenhagen, which is a kind of design group of some kind. And what they mentioned in passing is, what they usually would have done in the course of things is she would have flown to Copenhagen and they would have had an event and there would have been a small number of people. And instead, they put it online and their promotion was good enough that they had 250 people at it.
Mm. Mhm.
And this was actually more of a sort of foresight futurist kind of thing rather than a book promotion, although she certainly got to promote her books. But it was really interesting to me that they were finding that they were getting about 10 times the turnout of very engaged people by doing it that way as part of an ongoing reading series that had shifted online from being an existing reading series.
And from
the
different
only
places.
thing you would miss with an online one is you couldn't get the book signed on the spot.
The book sales. Sarah knows about that.
Oh, yes. Well, I don't know that what your situation is, Jim, that it's been hard to get books out to people, much less signed books.
Yes, I was fortunate that the initial push for Initiate was right before all this happened. So, it was probably leaving the shelves, slipping off the shelves at Barnes and Noble or whatever anyway by the time all the stores closed.
Mhm.
Given given their, egg salad shelf life for new novels. So yeah, at this point, it's all going to be Amazon sales anyway.
Pretty much.
Has any other bookseller managed to stay alive, or has Amazon pretty much eaten them all?
Well, there's a lot of specialty, retailers still.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's a whole separate ecosystem of online sites selling games or, role-playing game books and things like that.
The indies are all getting together on bookshop.org, which basically is their alternative to Amazon. And you can get pretty much anything off bookshop.org.
I just hate giving Amazon so much power, especially given who runs it.
Mhm.
Yep.
But most of what I order gets delivered.
That part of Amazon is great. I just think, well, I don't have a lot of respect for the people that I came through the high-tech world with.
Agreed.
Yep.
And I think many of them have serious personality disorders. I'm not joking in the slightest about it.
Oh, I know.
Unfortunately, I have worked with very closely with some people who I think had absolutely no moral compass and no understanding of what that meant.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of no moral compass, Jim, I
don't think that came across the way you intended.
haven't finished. I was talking.
Sorry,
I was interested in how you got into having a guy who's apparently a murderer as your hero.
Well, okay, we're going to get deep into the weeds here. Part of it was, for a long time, I've been saying that my experience writing for role-playing games gave me a lot of things I had to unlearn, because in games, characters become more powerful as the events go on. In a novel, arguably, the character should lose their advantages and have to rely only on themselves at the climax. So I said I had to unlearn that. But basically with this one, I'm writing a book about somebody who is basically leveling up as the book goes on. So instead, what he's losing is, well, his moral compass. He is, becoming more and more corrupt as the story goes on. And so at the climax, he basically makes a moral choice. He has to realize that what he is doing has been wrong, and try to atone for it. And that would be more the focus of the sequel. Yeah, it was actually, I have to say, one can actually be kind of gleeful about it. And I did make sure that most of the people he murders are worse than him. So, you do get the whole, I don't remember which crime thriller it's in where somebody says something like, I think it's one of Frank Miller's Sin City comics, where one of his tough guys says, I like killing hitmen. You don't feel bad,
So how many people does he kill? I haven't read this book yet, sadly.
His direct body count.
When you have to add it up, it's
His
bad.
direct body count is, I think, only 4, but he is indirectly responsible for 2, at least, no, sorry, 5. There's his direct body count is 5, but he is indirectly responsible for anywhere between 4 and an indeterminately high number of casualties, depending on how you count things. So, yeah, he winds up with a lot to atone for. And so if there's a sequel, the big part of that would be the focus. I specifically moved it to, I put it in a specific year, partly in order to give myself something to hang the sequel on, because originally it was just sort of set in the indeterminate present, but I decided to specifically make it happen all in 2014 through 2016 so that I could save the 2017 solar eclipse for a follow-up. Because I knew I was keeping the action all in and around New York City, so there would be no point in having the eclipse in the story with that. But, you know, now he can go off, leave New York and go on a bit of a road trip for the sequel.
Did you see the eclipse?
I did, as a matter of fact. My family, we went down to Charleston in August, which is, well, put it this way, I grew up in New Orleans, and now I understand why some of my ancestors moved from Charleston to New Orleans. It was to go someplace cool.
I never thought of New Orleans as being cool.
Neither had I, but after Charleston I did.
So we get the 2017 solar eclipse in the sequel.
Right.
There needs to be a sequel.
Okay. I'll make a note of that.
And what are you working on now?
So the book I'm working on now is called The Gödel Operation, and it is part of a sequence that I'm calling The Billion Worlds, which is all set about 8 millennia from now in the solar system when it has become a Dyson sphere, a true Dyson sphere, not a giant ping pong ball surrounding the sun, but just a halo of objects that soak up all of the sun's output. And one of the things I realized was that you can tell all of the classic old space opera tropes in a setting like that, because, you know, there really are a billion worlds, which means that you can have any society you can imagine, pretty much, if you count like asteroids and terraform moons and artificial habitats and whatnot. And they're all within relatively short transit of each other, so you can have, you know, characters traveling from world to world with regular old rocket motors, without having to violate relativity or anything like that. And, you know, there is the question of, well, you know, what about all this godlike future technology that we will have then? And I sort of found a way around that yes, such things exist, but most ordinary humans don't have it. You know, they merely have, you know, an incredibly utopian lifestyle by our standards. But, you know, there are still limits on how much matter there is and how much energy one can get, and so it's
utopian until things go wrong.
Yeah. Well, and also it would be like writing about the modern world, right? In the modern world, we have, you know, cell phones and highly advanced computer technology and all the rest, but you could write a story about a group of people living in a remote village in southern Colombia or something, and you would not have cell phones and highly advanced computer technology playing a large role in that story. You can still tell a story in the modern world in which people have basically 19th century technology.
Oh yeah, and 16th century technology.
Right.
But they all have cell phones.
Well, that's true, yes, because towers are a lot easier to maintain than copper. But so yes, so I'm focusing on the, you know, the poor marginal figures who are merely godlike by our standards.
So the initiate is out now.
Correct. In stores, there were stores open, available on Amazon or from the Bain Books website.
The initiate. Thank you.
Thank you.